I don't trust Putin an inch, and without any form of mechanism or indeed guarantees, he'll be back. He will rearm and he will be back. I mean, his stated aim is that Ukraine doesn't really exist, and he believes it's part of Greater Russia. So he will be back.
Both the UK and US defence secretaries are in Munich this morning talking about Donald Trump's plans to end the war in Ukraine and bring Vladimir Putin in from the cold. There is a difference of tone. American Pete Hegseth says it isn't a betrayal of Ukraine to look for peace. A bit of a difference from the UK's Defence Secretary John Healey, though, who says Ukraine has to be at the heart of any talks. Also in Munich is the former Conservative Defence Secretary, Sir Ben Wallace, and we can talk to him now. Good morning.
Good morning.
Now, there's been a lot of back and forth, and some of the comments are still coming in, actually, from the US side. But taking stock of what we've heard so far, Ben Wallace, what is your take on what's happened and what it means for Ukraine?
Well, there's sort of two parts to the US announcement and position on defence. One is something we've all expected, and, we were given plenty of warning for the last 10 years, which was Europe should carry a greater burden of its responsibility for its own security and not take for granted the United States support. I've been on your radio program numerous times making the point that the US are on the hook for 340,000 troops to come to our aid. And it goes way back to 2014. The only thing that President Obama actually agreed with Donald Trump on was 2% of GDP on defense and greater. And Europe has just basically ignored that for 10 years. And, we've continued to raid our defense budgets across the continent to pay for our social policies and our other priorities. And I think Trump in the end has come along in a cruder way, but nevertheless, the same message that he's had enough. And why should all those Americans be on the hook when we aren't prepared to stand up and take our responsibility? And I think that's one part of the announcement that, that's the truth, like it or not, uncomfortable for lots of us. That is the reality of it, and we need to address that. The bit that worried me the most of the announcement, though, was this sort of reaching across to President Putin, the lack of support for Zelensky in his press conference yesterday, President Trump, where he wouldn't even say if he viewed them as equals, Trump and Zelensky, and indeed didn't really feel that Zelensky was going to be a major player in these negotiations. It was going to be President Putin and the United States. And then there was a statement by the US Defense Secretary just before NATO and at NATO that is a really big change for us all in the West, certainly in Europe, that America has said it will no longer be able to be the primary guarantor of security of Europe. Now, that is a major policy shift of the last 75 years. And, that's a real sense of regret for me that the United States, the world has been better when the United States was both a moral leader defending freedom, democracy, and a military leader. And that language is a reversal of that. And that is something that we should all really worry about in the short term.
Do you think America under Donald Trump has walked away from that moral and military leadership?
I think he has. I mean, to be fair, MAGA is all about America first. Leadership is not about being first. It's about being generous and bringing people with you. But, make no mistake, make America great again, America first, put everything first for Donald Trump. And that means we're going to have to both step up to fill the void in Europe and show our own leadership. And, there's no harm in doing that. We could do that today if we wanted to. But it is also a signal that I'm afraid will embolden the likes of the Putins, the President Xi's, the Iranians, because they will now see that what preoccupies the United States is purely really a domestic agenda and its own shores. And it will be ambiguous at best when it comes to protecting sovereignty, freedom and democracy. And I think that's the biggest worry we have to face.
I want to come back to some of the domestic questions that you raised there for the UK, especially around defence spending. But on what happens next for Ukraine, the reality is there does need to be a peacekeeping force along that border. If America is not prepared to provide it, nor to provide any support for it, you've said the UK could do some of that. We obviously can't do it alone. But do you feel that it's the right foundation? Is it a good idea for the UK to send troops to that border now, given what America has said?
Well, I think there are two parts of it. First of all, I regret that the United States has already set out its negotiating position in advance. It's told Putin he'll get what he wants when it comes to no membership of NATO, and he's told Putin that he basically can keep the land he's got. And negotiations and the skill of deterrence is all about being ambiguous and keeping your opponent guessing until either the last minute or the crunch time. So I think that's a difficult position to start your negotiations from in the first place. But yeah, look, if I was sitting as Defence Secretary today and Boris Johnson or my other prime ministers I served under were sitting next to me, I'd be saying, right, no point, crying over spilt milk. There's no point trying to pretend that Donald Trump Mark II hasn't happened. Either we decide to lead as a continent, or we are just, shown to be hollow and false. And so, today at Munich, most of the defence ministers or the foreign ministers will be here. Europe could say, thank you very much. We are going to increase our defence spending. We're not going to play games. We're not going to pretend we'll increase our defence spending as the current Labour government does when conditions allow. It always should be when threat allows, to be honest. And we could start doing it. Press the buttons, start making the equipment available, and start putting together an international peacekeeping force, to go into Ukraine at the key spots, to be at the very least a guarantor and to be present on their territory if we wanted to do it.
And would you be saying that publicly? Because crucially, Keir Starmer isn't.
I don't see what Keir Starmer isn't showing any leadership at all in this, nor really is David Lammy. All we can see is the only leadership is like trying to get rid of the Chagos Islands as soon as he possibly can, but not actually addressing the threat to Britain, which right now should be that. If I was Keir Starmer, somebody's got to lead. Someone in Europe has got to actually put their head above the parapet. Now, that could be Macron, that could be Starmer, that it's not going to be Schultz. He's in the middle of an election, and he really hasn't got the qualities to do that. But someone has to, and the Poles are doing a pretty good job. And what I learned during the lead up and during the invasion of Ukraine all those years ago was that people will get behind Britain or get behind other European powers. You just have to put the work in. I remember visiting 21 countries in the year of the invasion in Europe, building that support, making sure we got those donations. I held the first donor conference, not the United States, and we got 28 nations on day one. You can build, if you put your effort in, a leadership and a coalition. The big question is, do we want to put our money where our mouth is, or do we want to actually turn our rhetoric into action? Now, the exact mechanism of how you would secure Ukraine from Putin coming back, because that is the big question for Zelensky. Last time he invaded in 2014, the West did nothing. Trump comes back for another bite of the country. I don't trust Putin an inch. And without any form of mechanism or indeed guarantees, he'll be back. He will rearm and he will be back. I mean, his stated aim is that Ukraine doesn't really exist, and he believes it's part of Greater Russia. So he will be back, and that's the question Zelensky has to answer his own people. How do we make sure that 2014, 2022 doesn't become 2028?
Yeah.
And we need that as a solution.
And one of the things we've been hearing about this morning is the fear that potentially a pro-Putin leader could replace President Zelensky in Ukraine. I only have one final question for you, or time for one final question. I have many more I wish I could ask. And it's about the domestic implications here. You've said that you think the UK should be spending more on defence. Many people think even 3% wouldn't be enough. What would you put that figure at? And do you think now we need a recruitment drive in this country for the military if we are seriously considering sending tens of thousands potentially of people to that border to help Ukraine in the future?
Well, I think, look, first of all, when I was serving in North Germany at the British Army of the Rhine, we were spending about 4.2% of our GDP on defence. We did still manage to have an NHS and an education system and a social security system. It wasn't a sort of, all or nothing choice. So we can make some different priorities in our government spending and find the money. The thing that's really important about defence spending is a lot of it is capital projects. You're buying ships, you're buying armoured vehicles. You can't immediately press a button and deliver them off a production line. So, we should make a target that's real, a date, 3% by 2030 would be realistic. You'd be able to realistically spend and recruit people in a rising defence budget. What you can't do is a sort of hockey stick, start and stop budget. You need to indicate to the Treasury and the public We're on a rising trajectory, getting to 3% by 2030 or 3.5%, whatever it is. But, you need to make it sustainable and also in a way that you can grow as you get the budget. Now, we can do it. I think something like 60,000 people apply to join the army every year, and we only take 15,000 or even less. And I know John Healey's done a good job of trying to change those criteria, and that would help. But we have to do all of it. We have to talk to the public that we all have a role to play, contribute to our defence.
Sir Ben Wallace, former Conservative Defence Secretary in Munich at the Security Conference. Really appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you.
Now, listening to that interview with Sir Ben Wallace, there was the Times World Affairs editor Catherine Philp, who's in Kyiv. Morning.
Good morning, Kate.
I'll get your reaction to what Ben Wallace was saying there. I mean, what did you make of his take of what's happened overnight?
Well, I think Ben is being as pragmatic as he always is. It does appear that this is a done deal, and that Europe is being frozen out of these discussions over Ukraine's future. I mean, not only Europe in its entirety, but Ukraine as well. The view from Kyiv, where I am, is that, one of, I think, possibly not surprised at some of the things that Pete Hegseth said yesterday in Brussels, but the tone of what Trump's accounting of his discussion with Putin, I think, was deeply disturbing here in Kyiv. The idea that, these kind of great powers will be negotiating over the heads of both Europe and Ukraine is a blow.
But you opened there by talking about the deal being done, and it may well be an actual very real financial deal, because while there is a defence aspect to this, we heard this morning from our Ukrainian expert that there is a rare minerals deal on the table at the moment. How significant is that?
Yeah. I mean, this is interesting because although, the tendency is to sort of compare it to Trump's pursuit of Greenland and his sort of rapacious wish to take over territory because of its natural resources. This was actually a proposition that Zelensky put forward a good 6 months ago in his victory plan, that America could get favored access to Ukraine's untapped mineral resources, things like lithium and uranium and rare metals. I think that the reason that Zelensky did that was he was trying to think as Trump does about, to approach this very transactional leader with a deal that might benefit him. And so that essentially was a way to reel the US in. Yeah. However, it doesn't appear that it's worked in the sense of bringing the Trump administration in on Ukraine's terms. I mean, one of the interesting things is that actually a lot of those mineral deposits are in areas that are occupied by Russia. Now, it doesn't look from what the US is saying and the conditions it's already laid out. And I would agree with Ben as well that this is not what you do. You don't you don't surrender to your negotiating partner all those points before you've actually started to talk. But if these mineral deposits in the Russian-occupied territories are lost to Ukraine, then no deal that the US does with Ukraine can access them. However, it might be a greater incentive for Trump to make sure that the rump of Ukraine, whatever is left after a deal is done, that effectively takes away those territories, that it is able to protect itself and function as an independent entity.
Catherine Philp, Times World Affairs editor, thank you very much for your time.
And just picking up what Ben Wallace said there, does Britain want to lead? Do you want Britain to lead? Would you be happy living in a country that suddenly starts spending 3% of GDP on defence, starts recruiting soldiers, starts saying, you know what we're going to do? We're going to guarantee the security of Ukraine. We're going to try and drag along a load of countries as America moonwalks off the field, gets out of the European security business entirely, and it's the UK who is going to be responsible for the security of Europe. Is that even possible? Is not what the whole tenor of the last 40 years has gone, has it? We've been basically reducing our army, got smaller and smaller and smaller. Could we even do it? Ben Wallace thinks we can, but could we really be the country that says, as America leaves, we hold on to the security of Europe?
Well, Larissa Brown, the Times Defence editor today, has a really interesting piece worth reading in the paper about exactly that, about what it would take. And she has calculated that 100,000 troops would be needed essentially to police that border, which means 300,000 in reality, because you can't have everybody just doing that job all the time. And the UK could maybe send 20,000 max. Well, obviously, there's a huge gap there. So where do they come from? And there is already a shortage of peacekeepers in the UN. So we may need to look much further afield than Europe for those numbers. And would people, we were talking about Gen Z all week and their preparedness to fight a war.
Yeah.
Would they be prepared to step up and join the military?
And so striking that, isn't it? We've been talking about this issue for 2.5 hours. It's the first mention of the UN.